Hey guys, I'm back with a new video. From this video onwards, I would like to cover some of the advanced topics of the JavaScript language, but before encountering them, we first need to revisit some concepts which you must be knowing about if you have been following the entire playlist. So if you haven't followed the playlist from the start, I would highly recommend you to bookmark my JavaScript playlist so that you can revisit it when required. So enough of talking, let us do a refresher of the basic stuff first, which serves as a prerequisite before we start with those advanced topics. Let us start with the topic called as scopes. So if you have been following the entire playlist, you must be knowing that we have three different scopes in JavaScript. First one is the function scope. Then we have the global scope. Or you can say the root scope. And then the third one is the block scope. Now as a side note, the first two scopes, the function scope and the global scope, are important when you are working with the var keyword for creating variables, whereas the block scope works with the let and const keywords. So let us understand the real meaning of scope. Now scope is something that determines the accessibility or the visibility of the variables. So using this concept, you can determine where in your code you can use which variables. So for example, if you create a new function, then that creates a new scope. So if you later define a variable inside this new function, then that variable will not be accessible from outside this function that you just created. So this we know from the previous videos. So let us practically see this concept in action. So let us head over to Visual Studio Code, and here I have a scopes folder inside which I have an HTML file in which there is a script linked to the app.js JavaScript file. So let us first log here console.log inside the JavaScript file, and let us head over to the browser to see if the file got successfully linked or not. Okay, so we are getting it right here. Now we know that we have three keywords using which we can create a new variable. So we can declare a variable using the var keyword, and we also have other two keywords, let and const, which I will briefly touch again, though we have already seen them in action in our previous videos. So let us define a variable name using the var keyword. Var name, set this to Alex. Now var is the older way of declaring variables, but this is how we used to define our variables in older versions of JavaScript, and you will still find them being used in some scripts. So this is how we define a variable in JavaScript using the var keyword. We first declare a variable and we set it to some value, which is Alex here. Or optionally, we can just declare the variable and set a value to it later in our script once we have a value for it. So let us log the name variable to the console. So console.log name. And if we now head over to the browser and give this a preview, you can see Alex is getting logged to the console. So the thing you need to understand here is that we define a variable here in the global scope, or you can say the root scope of the file. By global scope, I mean that it is sitting directly in the file and not within a function. So by global scope, we mean that this variable that we just defined is now available and accessible through our JavaScript file, which is app.js, and it can even be accessed in all the JavaScript files that we import right after this script. So now let us see an example for function scope, or you can say the local scope. So for this, let us create a function and let us name it as Christmas wish. So function Christmas wish, and then let us define a new variable right inside it and set it to James. So var name, set this to James. Now let us log here wishing Christmas, and let us also interpolate the variable right within the string using template strings. So Merry Christmas, and here I can interpolate the name variable like this, and let us add an emoji as well. So Christmas, this one, okay, like this. Now let us give this a whirl by invoking the function, so Christmas wish, and head over to the browser to see what we get. And you can see it says Merry Christmas and the emoji and James. Now one thing I want you to understand here is that we have two variables with the same name, which is name, but the difference between the two variables is that one is sitting in the global scope, and the other one is sitting in the function scope. So this variable name is sitting in the function scope, or you can say inside the local scope. So for the log that we have for the Christmas wish function, here the name will refer to the one that we have right inside the closest scope in which the log is wrapped, which is the function scope, which is this variable, and hence we get Merry Christmas James and not Merry Christmas Alex, right? Now had there been no name variable inside the function Christmas wish, then it would have referred to the outer scope of this function, that is the name variable that is sitting in the global scope, and in that case the output would have been Merry Christmas Alex. So I hope this makes perfect sense. Now let us move further and understand how this scope thing actually works. So now let us try to log something to the console in the global scope which we haven't even defined yet. So let us log h to the console, and currently we are not having any declaration for it. So console.log h. So what do you expect to get for this log? So let us head over to the browser to see what we get. And you can see it says uncaught reference error, age is not defined. So here you can see JavaScript is not able to find the variable age in the global scope. Now what if I define the variable age inside the function, which is this function Christmas wish? So let us say here for age set this to 21. So with this minor change, what do you expect to get for console log at line 15? Let us head over to the browser to see if we get 21 for this log or not. Let us make a reload, and you can see again we are getting the reference error. So what is the reason for this? So even after defining the age variable in our file right inside the function, we are not able to reference it inside the global scope, and again we are getting the reference error. And the reason for this is same, that the age variable does not exist in the global scope of the file. So any variable that we define right inside the function, for example these two variables, name and age, only exist within the scope of the function. Now once the function is done, these variables get destroyed, so you can only access these variables from right inside the function in which they were defined in, but not outside. So in essence, in order to access the variable age in the global scope, we want it to be only defined in the global scope so that we can access it. So let me comment this buggy line. Now let us go over the rules that one should keep in mind regarding the scope. Now the first, as I just mentioned, that the variables that you define in the outer scope, for example a variable that is defined outside the function like this name variable, can be accessed within the function too, but a variable that is defined inside a function cannot be accessed from outside the function. Now let me demonstrate this with the help of an example. Let us first define a boolean variable, again using the var keyword, is done, and let us set this to false to begin with. Now right here let us define a function and name it as water plants, and within it let us again use the var keyword to define a new variable. Let us name it as plant count, so var plant count, and set this to a value of 5. Now let us write a for loop that iterates 5 times and logs something to the console each time. So for var I as 0, I less than plant count, I plus. So let us log here watering the plant. Let us use template strings, watering the plant, and let us use the plant number, so I plus 1, like this. Now right after this for loop, but within the water plants function, let us access the isDone boolean that we defined right outside the function and change its value to true. And finally for the function, let us log a message done to the console, console.log done. Now before testing out this function, let us also try to log the plant count to the console but outside the function in which it was defined in order to prove my point. So let us say here console.log before the function call, and let us reference plant count here. Next let us invoke the water plants function, so water plants. Now let us log the value of isDone to see what it gives us. So console.log isDone, And finally, let us log to the console.log after the function call plant count. So let us give this a preview in the browser to see what we get. Let us make a reload. So you can see we are getting a reference error for the log that we defined just above the function call. It says plant count is not defined. So right here, because of the same reason that I mentioned, that if you define something right within the function, for example plant count, you cannot access it from outside the function, and hence the error. So let me comment the line 28. And now let us again head over to the browser to see what we get. So now you can see our function did run, and it says watering the plant 1, watering the plant 2, and watering till watering the plant 5. Then the function changes the value of isDone variable that we defined in the global scope. We logged done to the console, and if we access the variable isDone in the global scope, we get the value true. Because as you can see that isDone variable is sitting in the global scope, so you can reference it from the global scope. So this works. And next, the line 31 still gives the same error. Plant count is not defined because the plant count variable is local to this function, and you cannot access anything that is defined inside a function from outside, right? So let us comment this too. So I hope everything makes sense till this point. Now let us talk about the block scope in JavaScript. Now with the introduction of let and const keywords in ES6 JavaScript, a new scope, block scope, was introduced into the language. So whenever you use these curly braces and the let and const keywords inside of these curly braces, you are essentially defining variable using one of these keywords inside of the block that is surrounded by this pair of curly braces. So now let us understand the block scope with the help of an example. So let us say block scope. So let us first define an if block first. So if, and here let us say true, so that this code block always runs. Now right within this curly braces, now these curly braces denotes a block scope. And right inside the curly braces, let us define a new variable using the var keyword. So var username, and set this to the nerdy div. And then let us log the username variable to the console. Let us also log the username variable right outside the if block in which we defined it. So console.log username. So now let us give this a preview in the browser, and you can see that for both the logs, it is logging the nerdy div to the console. Now the same thing holds true for other constructs like loops too. But if I make a slight change to the above code by simply changing the var keyword to let and then give it a preview in the browser, you can see for the first log that we defined right inside the block, we got the nerdy div. But for the log that is outside the if block, we get the reference error, username is not defined. So now you can see this time we are getting the username being logged to the console for the log that we defined inside the if block. Because with the let keyword, it uses block scoping, so the username variable now can only be accessed from within the block only in which it was defined in, and not outside the block. If we try to access a variable outside the block in which it was defined in which it was defined using the let keyword or the const keyword, you cannot simply access the same variable that you defined within the block from outside, right? So accessing a variable that was declared using the let keyword within a block from outside will simply throw a reference error, as you can see. Now what if we define a variable on the global scope using the const or let keyword, though the variable in this case seems to be defined on the global scope, but it also falls technically into the block scope. But since it is sitting on the root of the file, we can access it from anywhere, be it an if block or be it inside a loop or any other construct. So this was all I wanted to cover about scopes in JavaScript. If you liked the video, do give it a thumbs up or comment down below if you have any query. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the very next one.